and popular Florida Governor Jeb. Bush left the Navy and graduated from Yale before he and Barbara moved to Texas to find his dreams on an oil field. By the age of 30, he was co-founder and president of Zapata Offshore, which pioneered experimental drilling equipment. But just like his father, Bush was attracted to public service and politics. After losing his first political race for a Senate seat in 1964, he was elected to the House of Representatives 2 years later, serving 2 terms. A Kuwaiti court would convict all but one of the defendants. Bush retired to Texas with Barbara, getting in a few rounds of horseshoes and celebrating countless birthdays by parachuting out of planes, spending time with the family in Maine and reliving memories of when he was a boy.
I can honestly say that the 3 most rewarding titles bestowed upon me are the 3 that I've got left: a husband, a father, and a granddad.
While retired, his life was active until the end, joining forces with former political foe Bill Clinton to raise money for the victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The former presidents formed a close friendship, continuing their charity work and enjoying annual lunches at Bush's home in Kennebunkport, and using his experience and insights to serve as a quiet advisor to his eldest son, the 43rd president. Here, attending George W. Bush's Presidential Library dedication in 2013 and sharing a few words.
We're glad to be here. God bless America, and thank you very much. Good job.
Bush even kept up with public debate by joining Twitter, where he often shared photos of his colorful socks that became part of his signature look. Age brought health challenges, of course, a form of Parkinson's disease that left him in a wheelchair, and brief hospital stays in his 90s for pneumonia, bronchitis, and a fall in his home. But not enough to keep him out of the limelight. Throwing out the first pitch before a 2016 baseball game and pregame ceremonies months later at the Super Bowl in his Houston hometown. Reuniting with his former running mate and Vice President Dan Quayle in July, and then catching a glimpse of the rare eclipse that crossed the country alongside his family in Maine in August. One of Bush's last public appearances was at his beloved wife Barbara's funeral, where he met with former presidents, first ladies, and the current First Lady, Melania Trump. Bush recently returned to his vacation hometown of Kennebunkport, Maine, joining fellow veterans for a pancake breakfast before he was hospitalized for low blood pressure and fatigue. This was the first time in decades that neither he nor his wife attended the annual Memorial Day parade. He wrote in a tweet, he is, quote, forever grateful not only to those patriots who made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation, but also the Gold Star families whose heritage is imbued with their honor and heroism. Known for his maturity and straightforward approach, George H.W. Bush called this country to be better in hopes of inspiring the people to be great.
I think historians are going to say that we did pretty well, and that's all right for me. I'm not in any rush. Be in heaven, look down, let him make that determination.
Wow, and you think of the sweep of history, and I think he is someone whose legacy, you know, when he lost that election in '92 to Bill Clinton, it was seen like, oh, he's going to be seen as a failed president. I think he's one of these former presidents, now a late president, who over time, his legacy has just gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think also about, Brett pointed out how much time he spent in Kennebunkport. When I covered President Bush 43, I went back there, and it was such a small town. And people, the locals, just still have such reverence for the Bush family. You see them there at Walker's Point. And it's not a long walk to sort of the downtown area. But I remember hearing that as sitting vice president and then president-elect, he would go to the pharmacy himself to pick up prescriptions. And finally, the Secret Service said, you know, Mr. President-elect, you can't go to the pharmacy anymore. It's like, what are you talking about? I've been doing this my whole life. And though he was seen as this wealthy patrician man, he was so, as someone who got to know him a little bit, so down to earth, so down to earth.
The last line of that piece, you heard the late president saying he wasn't in a rush. But that said, take a look at all he accomplished at such a young age. He was an oil tycoon for all intents and purposes by the age of 30. He married very, very young, the youngest aviator in U.S. Navy history, and he had his first child while in college. That child, our 43rd president, and he had the following to say: Jeb, Neil, Marvin, Doro, and I are saddened to announce that after 94 remarkable years, our dear dad has died. George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ever ask for. The entire Bush family is deeply grateful for 41's life and love, for the compassion of those who have cared and prayed for Dad, and for the condolences of our friends and fellow citizens.
As well, his son Jeb Bush Jr. saying, "Nothing gave me my Gampy more joy than service to others, especially supporting and caring for those who risk making the ultimate sacrifice every day. His leadership taught us to be kinder and gentler, to love each other. We will miss him dearly."
So important for us to highlight family there. You mentioned the birth of George W. Of course, Robin was the daughter that was born, who died, I believe, at the age of 4. And it's so moving that throughout their entire lives, both George and Barbara Bush talked about how devastating that was for them. And there's, there was this political cartoonist who did an image when Barbara died just a few months ago, Barbara Bush, the former First Lady, I should say, that had Robin waiting for her in heaven. And then now that political cartoonist has now updated that image.
It's beautiful.
To show George H.W. Bush coming in a Navy plane. And we're going to show that in a few moments. But basically, now holding hands, Robin and Barbara in heaven saying, "We were waiting for you, George H.W. Bush."
He was an absolute war hero, and something that I found so remarkable as well from his service, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, he postponed college and enlisted in the U.S. Navy on his 18th birthday, becoming the youngest aviator in the U.S. Navy. And
yeah, go ahead.
And at the time, and during his service as an officer, he read the letters of the enlisted men before they were sent home to ensure that they were compliant with, classified issues. And he referenced that. He referenced that experience in part as the humanizing quality that he had, the ability to connect all that he knew about the soldiers and the constituents, his future constituents in the country, that he learned what life was like in the Midwest. He learned what life was like in large cities and small towns from reading those letters and reading those that came from the have-nots.
Such a great, important point. And I mentioned that a moment ago, that he came from great wealth. And it's easy for us in the media, and I saw this throughout his presidency, a lot of people just sort of cast him as this wealthy guy, out of touch. And yet what Emily was just saying, I mean, stop there and think about that for a minute. At the age of 18, after Pearl Harbor, he's the son of Senator Prescott Bush of Connecticut. He's wealthy. He could avoid war. He doesn't have to enlist in the Navy.
He postponed Yale, not a state school.
Let's go to Yale. Yeah. Let's go make a lot of money after that. You could do all of that. Instead, no. He served his country. And I think that is so important to underline, and is a good transition to our friend and colleague, Pete Hegseth, who's at the Reagan Presidential Library this morning. It was previously scheduled. He's doing an event there. We were planning to have you on the show, but not to talk about the life and legacy of George H.W. Bush. But now we have that opportunity. And you, Pete, as someone who served our country as well, reflect a little bit on the service that we saw from the former president.
Yeah, I mean, only being at George H.W. Bush's presidential library would be more fitting, but still fitting here at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, because without Ronald Reagan as president, you likely never have President George H.W. Bush. This Air Force One as well, used by Ronald Reagan here at this library, but also used by George H.W. Bush. So a lot of history behind us. And as you mentioned, you mentioned his service, which is so central to who he was and how his generation, the greatest generation, was forged. I can only liken it to my own experience after 9/11, a generation of men and women mobilized for war to defend this nation. As you said, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. I read about it in the history books, but for that generation, It awoke America to service and a vicious enemy abroad. And you mentioned it, you said it, I don't need to repeat it, but he went to Phillips Exeter as a son of a senator, wealthy family, could have gone to Yale, instead enlisted as a naval aviator. And as a naval aviator, he got the job stationed on aircraft carriers, assigned to a torpedo squadron, saw some of the most significant Pacific battles aboard the USS San Jacinto. Engaging with Japanese enemies on multiple occasions, over 58 combat missions that he flew over the course of his time in World War II. A fateful day, as you've all alluded to, was on September 2nd, 1944. He was a part of a bombing run. He was hit by his plane was hit by anti-aircraft gunfire. Set ablaze. His engine is on fire. Yet while his engine's on fire, he completes the attack, releases bombs on the Japanese enemy submarines below, hit the target, destroying those targets, then still ablaze, knowing if captured, he'll likely be tortured and killed, flies miles out with his engine on fire to bail out. The other member of his crew, unfortunately, his parachute does not deploy. George H.W. Bush's parachute does deploy. For 4 hours, he's in an inflatable raft in the middle of the Pacific, rescued by a U.S. submarine. As I mentioned, others who were captured in that attack were killed. And it left H.W. Bush to ask, why had I been spared, and what does God have for me? I think, so you talk about the medals, a Distinguished Flying Medal, or excuse me, Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 air medals, but as a future public servant, and someone who came out of World War II, hailed a hero, he also said, what more can I give back to my country? Yep. And you saw that in going to Texas, running for office, all the things he did, as you've mentioned before. So the military aspect of George H.W. Bush should be celebrated as a reminder of a generation that we're losing more and more of each single day.
And Pete, to add on to what he did following all those sacrifices that he did give to the country as a soldier, not only congressman, like you mentioned, UN ambassador, RNC chair, CIA director, liaison to China, and of course, vice president and president. He was from that generation, Pete, like you said, that viewed public service sort of as an obligation, not as something, a way to make money later on in your future. He'd already made his money, so much of it, at least, you know, in his 30s, as a millionaire, and he'd already served his country as a war hero. But then to give so many more years, decades, in fact, to his country really does speak to his legacy.
His presidency
he could have coasted on it, but he ultimately earned it. I mean, this is a guy we know as a former congressman, and for his successes. But he lost just as much as he won. He lost his first race for the U.S. Senate in Texas before then becoming a congressman. Then Richard Nixon comes to him, asks him to run for the Senate against one of his rivals. He loses that race, so he makes him the UN ambassador. Of course, famously lost in 1980 to Ronald Reagan before becoming his running mate, winning. So, I mean, this is a guy who's seen a lot of successes and a lot of highs, but a lot of difficulties as well, which is a part of the American spirit. When you fail, you pull yourself up and you keep fighting in service of something greater than yourself. And I think this morning that's something to remember with George Herbert Walker Bush.
Absolutely, Pete. And you know, when he lost his second presidential election, his staff and children, they stated that they learned grace and defeat from that was such a learning moment from them, that he demonstrated and he exhibited such grace in defeat and despite defeat. His presidency was remarkable as well. You know, it was said that at the Prime Minister's residence in the UK, he was the only visitor to shake hands with the doorman, and that in the dissolution of the USSR, that Gorbachev's first phone call was to then President H.W. Bush, and how remarkable that was, that the level of connection and how prolific these connections were that he made across the world. He created coalitions, literally, but also that he knew the names of every staff member, and every staff member's spouses and families, referenced them by name. That amount of grace and, again, humility, connection that he exhibited in all of his positions. You know, as congressman, he signed the Open Housing Act, and that was despite that his backers didn't want him to, but he said, I fought with these men in the Pacific. They should live wherever they want, and I will stand for that.
He was a staunch advocate for that. We think of him as a World War II vet. We think of him for Desert Storm, for the coalition that he built to push back Saddam. We don't always think of him as a Cold Warrior, which we should. The wall fell under his watch alongside Ronald Reagan. Just about a half mile here at this location, there's a portion of that Berlin Wall. Talk about someone who followed through on Ronald Reagan's legacy to stare down the communists, tear down that wall, open that gate. That was George H.W. Bush, and he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Pete, we're going to be getting great insights, and we'll be coming to you throughout the morning. It's terrible that we have to even think about and contemplate the death of George H.W. Bush after so much service. But the fact you're at the Reagan Library can add this perspective is something we'll be doing all morning long. So we'll be back to you shortly.
You got it, guys.
All right. Here is former President Bush reflecting himself on his presidency. Watch.
I think I learned that we were fairly successful, and I remain convinced that we did it with honor, and that we were very corrupt-free administration. We managed humongous historical change, capsulized into a 4-year period with finesse, I think, with strength. As we saw, the Berlin Wall came down, Germany was unified, Eastern Europe was freed, Baltics were freed, Russia imploded, aggression was set back in the Gulf. We handled a very difficult situation at the time at Tiananmen Square with China. And so we were faced with major foreign policy problems, and I think we conducted ourselves pretty well. And I think that my resistance of some of these spending programs to try to correct the economy might have hurt me, but I think it was the right thing to do. And I was proud of things like the Americans with Disabilities Act and civil rights legislation.
Boy, when you go through that list, I said a moment ago that since he left office, people are now reflecting, boy, he was a much better president than people gave him credit for when he was in office. Our next guest knows that. She served under President George H.W. Bush as a young White House official. She's still young. I've known her a long time. She remembers the dedication he brought to the office and to this nation.
Joining us now, Anita McBride, former White House Director of Personnel for President George H.W. Bush. First, thank you for being here, and sorry for your loss. You worked so intimately with this man for so long. Just first thoughts this morning.
Well, thank you for having me, because, part of this, because it hurts, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to share reflections, and it helps. And I think what you said early on when the show started, that this is a celebration of George H.W. Bush's life. And it's a 94-year, long, full, adventurous life that he, as a young man with a young Barbara Bush, did together. A 73-year marriage. Just think of everything they accomplished personally and the example that they were to their own family, but to all of us young staffers in the White House. This was an incredible example of leadership, and as a loyal vice president also to Ronald Reagan, I mean, we just saw the best of the best.
Anita, you heard him reflecting there, and clearly it upset him to the last of his days that he had to go back on his word when he said, "Read my lips." That really bothered him, but it was for the better of the country. You reflect on that for us?
Sure, and that was a tough day in the White House, and he knew, and it permeated to everybody that he had gone back on his word. But he did do the right thing. He knew it was the right thing. He knew it would cost him.
The other part of that, when he was going through the list, what I'm remembering, you would know better than all of us, he had a hard time throughout his life about bragging because he didn't want to. It was instilled in him early. And his political advisors implored him in 92, and earlier too, in the 80 campaign, the 88, but particularly in 92, you got to talk about your successes. And he'd go out there and say, I did this, I did that. Wouldn't be prudent to, boast about it. And people sort of made fun of that line. Wouldn't be prudent. Right. But that was what was instilled in him by his mother, wasn't it? Absolutely
right. In the back of his mind always was Dorothy, Walker saying, "Don't brag, George." And that's why even now, as you're sort of going through this litany of all his successes, that it's almost an education for everybody again, because he himself didn't talk about it. In 1992, that election was so hard on all of us. We saw a George H.W. Bush that we admired so greatly really being diminished in a certain way, right in front of our eyes by the rhetoric of that campaign at that time that Bill Clinton had run against him. Yet, look at all those years later, he turned out to be the father that Bill Clinton never had.
Right. And when you look at his accomplishments, one area truly does stand out, and that is on the foreign stage.
Absolutely.
During my 4 decades on this planet, there is no presidential candidate or any president who has had such a distinguished foreign policy resume. In fact, the individuals that we had before and quite frankly after haven't had 1/10 of the foreign policy experience that President H.W.
Well,
Bush
and
had.
think of all the experience and background and opportunities he had to learn to be a foreign policy president, from being a young naval aviator and captured, and then going on to serve in all these positions that he did, even including a national party chair. I mean, sort of understanding the grassroots politics and how people feel about the country. He traveled extensively. Then he lived here in this city as UN ambassador, the time in Beijing. I mean, all of that prepared him to be able to be the kind of leader that we needed at a moment when the world was transformed. And in particular, when he talked about the Berlin Wall coming down, and so many of his advisors in the White House at the time were telling you, and even members of Congress, you need to go to Germany and you need to be there while this is happening. And he said, no, I'm not dancing on the wall that's coming down. This is the Germans' time. And because he knew that would not be prudent or appropriate, and it would be bragging that it was he who did it. It was not. It was the people.
Right. And Anita, many people talk about his wonderful sense of humor as well, and that intertwined with his strength of leadership and his grace and humility and so much. But he was really funny, and he had a great sense of humor that his son said was never needling, it was always to enliven. Can you share with us any moments
all the time? Absolutely. And one moment that's really memorable for me, in 1992, again, the election was lost, everybody's feeling down, and what does George H.W. Bush do? He calls Dana Carvey, and he calls him directly at SNL and asks him to come. He said, my staff is feeling down. Would you come and just sort of cheer them up? And sat in the audience and watched.
We're going to play some of that later.
Oh, you are?
Yeah,
okay, perfect. I didn't know that.
But you're right, because he embraced. No, you're setting the table wonderfully, which is that, you know, he did make fun of himself. I want to fast forward to 2014. Sure. Because George W. Bush wrote a book. There's many books, of course, about the Bushes, but he wrote one called 41 a couple years ago. And he starts the book in late May 2014. It's about to be his father's 90th birthday, and he gets a call saying, your dad wants to go skydiving again. Among other things that happened, the night before, he finds his dad sitting at Walker's Point looking at the Atlantic Ocean, looking very reflective. And he's kind of nervous as a son, like, is he thinking about pulling out of this? He said, you know, Dad, what's going on? He's like, it's just beautiful. He's like, well, what are you thinking about? He says, it's just beautiful looking out there. And then they go for a few minutes without talking. And so W wonders, you know, what is he really thinking about? And W had been painting, so he had these cargo pants that were really dirty. Right. Finally, his father looks up and says, son, do those pants come in clean? You know, is there another version of them? And then he also says that the landing zone for the skydive was going to be at St. Anne's Church in Kennebunkport, which you know very well. They've had weddings there, family, all kinds of occasions. And Barbara Bush, I want to bring her into the conversation. You knew the first lady, the late first lady as well. She joked to the family as they were waiting. And by the way, I snapped that photo. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. In 2007, of them at Walker's Point. But the landing zone for the skydive was at St. Anne's Church, the lawn there.
By the cemetery.
By the cemetery. And Barbara Bush said, well, if he dies, it'll be a short carry to the burial.
That's right. She said if it doesn't go well, at least we're in a good spot.
I mean, talk about what kind of a family does that, where you're thinking, is this 90-year-old going to die? And they're making fun of it because they had fun together.
Right. There's a family with a sense of humor, and everybody just sort of, you know, pokes fun at each other, and obviously confident and loving is the best description.
Anita, we cannot thank you enough for being here on this day of celebration.
It makes me feel
such great
better.
memories,
It
yeah.
really does. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
I
for
do.
coming.
Glad you're here. Thank you.
If you are just joining us, people around the world remembering the life and legacy of George H.W. Bush.
The 41st president of the United States, always pushing a message of hope.
A new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law. Such is a world worthy of our struggle and worthy of our children's future.
The World War II veteran, American patriot, and lifelong public servant passed away last night at the age of 94.
All right, Casey Stegall is live outside his home in Houston with reaction from fellow former presidents, others around the world. Casey, good morning.
Good morning to you. Yeah, reaction really pouring in from all over, from high-ranking leaders to general members of the public who have dropped by the Black Iron Gate out here that's now decorated with white Christmas lights and wreaths. That's the Iron Gate that is the primary entrance into that exclusive neighborhood back there in Houston where President Bush lived and where he passed away in his home at 10:10 local time. People have been leaving flags and flowers and the like back there. President Trump released a statement earlier and moments ago took to Twitter and also said a little bit more, and we want to show that to you. It reads in part, I'm quoting here, President George H.W. Bush led a long, successful, and beautiful life. Whenever I was with him, I saw his absolute joy for life and true pride in his family. His accomplishments were great from beginning to end. He was a truly wonderful man and will be missed by all. And then, of course, you have President Obama, who just so happened to be in Texas this week, just Tuesday, and reportedly visited with President Bush here just a few days ago, and President Obama releasing a statement. We want to show that to you. America, he says, has lost a patriot and humble servant in George Herbert Walker Bush. While our hearts are heavy today, they are also filled with gratitude. Not merely for the years he spent as our 41st president, but for the more than 70 years he spent in devoted service to the country he loved. And then there is President Bill Clinton, former President Bill Clinton. They've got a joke that goes back and forth between the Bush family, saying that George W. is Bush's brother from another mother. Well, President Clinton saying today, few Americans have been or will ever be able to match President Bush's record of service to the United States and the joy he took every day from it. So this is going to be a wide-scale celebration of life from right here in Houston to up the road from us here in Texas at Bryan College Station, where the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum is located. Mourners have gathered there, and that will be the ultimate resting place. That is where Barbara is buried. There's a family plot on the grounds back there, and that is where President Bush will be finally laid to rest once the pomp and circumstance in Washington, and then he returns back here to Texas. A lot of busy days ahead.
Absolutely. Casey's live in Houston. We'll be getting back to you throughout the morning. Casey's right. There is a formal plan in place for every former president that they keep under wraps, but they talk to television networks and others to get prepared for. And just as we saw when President Reagan passed away and Gerald Ford, there will be a lot of pomp and circumstance likely lying in report.
This note, I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you. Good luck, George. And remember, that is 2 months after a bitter campaign.
It speaks so highly of the fact that Herbert Walker Bush was such a great man. Truly, he was such a great man in that he lost that, as you put, bitter election. He took it personally that he was not reelected because it was personal to him that he wasn't able to keep his word to the American people, even though he did it, as he put it, for his country. And you're right, it's an interesting relationship that developed. They became so close. Condoleezza Rice called them the odd couple. And the humility was also displayed when they received the Clintons, the president-elect at that time, Clinton, and his wife, Hillary, to the White House. And the staff had tears in their eyes. They were crying because they didn't want him to leave. And he said to the Clintons, pay them no mind. They'll do the same for you when you leave.
Well, you think about the humility and grace, the grace in someone who just beat you in an election to say, I'm rooting hard for you and all of that, especially you think about difficult political times we have now. Hard to believe you'd hear similar these days from either party. But then beyond that, I'm struck by the humility of, I'm not great at giving advice. Hang on a second. You know, you were a war hero. You were vice president, ambassador, you know, at the UN and China, and president of the United States. Oh, by the way, a father, grandfather, husband. Sounds to me like a wonderful role model and man, as Emily said, but also someone who probably has a little bit of advice to give to people. Sure. I'd take his advice, and yet he's saying, you know, I'm not good at giving advice. And Brad Blakeman served in the Bush administration. And Brad, talk about that kind of humility, that someone with that kind of resume, that kind of accomplishment, serving his country and all of the rest, is like, I'm not good at giving advice.
It's rare commodity. In this town of Washington, in a sea of politicians, George H.W. Bush was a statesman. He knew how to work with people. And a lot of it came from his military background and sports. He was competitive, but he could disagree without being disagreeable. He could work across the aisle when necessary. And he was a guy who was interested, first and foremost, in his country. Sure, he was a partisan. He was a Republican. And he was the leader of our party. He was our president. But George Bush saw beyond the partisan divide. And he understood that you had to work to the other side. And compromise wasn't a bad thing. You have to do it in every facet of your life. So why should politics be any different? And his great success was the ability to be human as president, right. and to not hot dog it. You know, his mother used to say braggadocio, and he would say that sometimes in speeches. And he really meant it. I saw him when the cameras weren't on. He was the real deal. He was the same guy before a camera as he was behind it, and he treated everybody with respect. He didn't care who you were.
We've touched upon this briefly this morning, but let's go back to the '92 election. You recall in January of 1991, here's an individual with, by many accounts, 90% approval rating, and yet just a few months later, he loses his bid for re-election. We've mentioned this braggadociousness or lack thereof. Do you think that if he had bragged about his foreign policy accomplishments, that he would have maintained the White House?
Well, it was an awful tough election. I was in it. You know, you can always say woulda, coulda, shoulda, but George H.W. Bush ran the campaign that he wanted to run. And if he had to do it over again, he probably would make some changes, but you can't change the guy he is. That's the way he is. He left it to others to do that, but I traveled probably to 50-some countries with him in almost every state, and I saw the respect he had for people, and he put others above himself constantly, and he changed the world for the better. And I found out in politics that great leaders are very rarely appreciated in their time. It's only after time when we can give a full perspective of their service. And he was a great man. He was a great president.
Brad, thank you so much for talking with us. We're going to keep you on standby. We look forward to hearing your thoughts throughout the morning.
Pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, something that Anita McBride touched on a moment ago, of course, is the relationship with Barbara Bush, married over 70 years, married on January 6, 1945. They had 6 children, 17 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren, and as I noted, marked their 73rd wedding anniversary just this year before they both passed, January 6, 2018.
Here's Barbara Bush on her husband. and who he is as a man.
He is the most decent, honorable, wonderful. Nobody's ever been as lucky as I've been. I want people to remember him as courageous. I want them to remember him as he is.
Think about that. Let's take a step back for a moment. 73 years in a day and age when relationships last 73 days in some instances. 73 years, started so very young, with all the trials and tribulations that one can have as a young couple, magnified by a war, magnified by so many different things.
Magnified by the death of their daughter, Robin, who I mentioned. She was only 4 years old, and that was very trying for them, obviously.
One of my favorite quotes by Barbara Bush was when she said, "I had none of the responsibilities and all of the joy of being his wife." He was an American patriot, a war hero so much, and she was by his side throughout it all. And she liked to joke and said that the only thing we fight about is who loves each other more. And she said, "I always win that."
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Condoleezza Rice, of course, she served on President Bush 41's National Security Council and later, of course, Secretary of State under his son's administration. She says President George Herbert Walker Bush was the epitome of a public servant. He loved America with all of his heart and served her as fully and completely as anyone ever has. I am so grateful I had the opportunity to work for him, to learn from him, and to experience his deep and abiding commitment to his fellow citizens. He was a mentor to me and a dear friend. That from Condi Rice.
And this from James A. Baker. Quote, "The legacy of George H.W. Bush will be forever etched in the history of America and the world. It is a lifelong record of selfless patriotic service to our nation. In each and every one of these positions, he led with strength, integrity, compassion, and humility, characteristics that define a truly great man and effective leader."
Well, our friend and colleague Pete Hegseth, as we mentioned, is at the Reagan Library. He's going to be joining us throughout the morning. Pete, I understand you've had a chance maybe to visit with some dignitaries who served in those past Republican administrations. They're reflecting on this life and legacy as well.
Yeah, I mean, great guests, guys. One of the silver linings of a day like this is you get the opportunity to reflect on a life well lived. You get an opportunity to talk to people who are in those moments with a man who is shaping history. And you put it all together with your guests and folks we're talking to here, and we're going to bring you into some exhibits here at the Reagan Library, including this Air Force One, which was used by George H.W. Bush, in addition to Ronald Reagan. We're at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library here in Simi Valley. You get a chance to put a story together. And the story of George Herbert Walker Bush, the more I hear you guys talk about it and tell it, it is the American story of the 20th century. It is the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It is the enlistment. It is the service in World War II. It's being shot down. It's being rescued. It's then a commitment to free enterprise back in Texas, and then jumping into the public square. You know, we defeated Imperial Japan and the Nazi Germany in World War II. Our temporary ally were the Soviets and the USSR, and then soon that becomes a Cold War, and over time developed a foreign policy consensus that we needed to win that Cold War. And you look at where George H.W. Bush was during that time: envoy to China, CIA director, UN ambassador, congressman. He was in the middle of developing that Washington, D.C. consensus that built America up to be able to challenge the USSR. Then comes the actor from California, the governor from California, Ronald Reagan, a more conservative choice than George H.W. Bush in 1980. And he runs on a staunch anti-communist. Let's build up our military, says this is an evil empire that we need to defeat. If we build up our military, maybe we can force them to up their spending and bring the Soviet Union down. He pushed the Star Wars Initiative, SDI, daring the Soviet Union to deal with our ability to shoot down nuclear weapons. As a result, the wall fell. He told them to open that gate, and the Soviet Union dissolved. And I think it was guys like George H.W. Bush, Cold Warriors, came out of World War II, committed to the new enemy that the free world faced. And then he partnered with someone like Ronald Reagan, who was prepared to shake up that consensus, say some things like evil empire, like tear down that wall, make deals on nuclear arms treaties that no one else could make because everyone knew Ronald Reagan was a staunch anti-communist. A partner in H.W. Bush who was that steady hand, who understood the institutions, who could reach across the aisle in a bipartisan sense with Democrats who were also staunchly anti-communist, who held those conservative beliefs, but a little bit more of an establishment fashion than Ronald Reagan. They were an unlikely partnership as foes in 1980, but once they came together and H.W. Bush had a chance to watch Reagan for 8 years, you might argue, sometimes history makes the men, and sometimes men make history. In this case, thank goodness that America had H.W. Bush in the wings in 1988, able to ride the popularity of Ronald Reagan and be there to follow through on the policies that had led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the defeat of the evil empire in the Soviet Union. All of these issues still face us today, but back then it was believed in the foreign policy establishment that the new political international norm was a rising and strong Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush thought otherwise, and the world was a better place because of it. So keep up the great coverage, guys. It's an opportunity to reflect on a life well lived, as I said.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Pete. Thank you for that insight. We will circle back with you shortly.
Yeah, and our next guest is also someone who was really on the ground for the Reagan Revolution that went into the continuation of that, of maybe what we might now call the Bush Revolution in a way. Craig Shirley, a longtime Republican operative. He's also a biographer of Ronald Reagan. He's joining us on the phone. Craig, it's so great to have you this morning. Certainly not under these circumstances. We wish it were not so. But your insight is important this morning. Reflect on what Pete Hegseth was just saying. He made a wonderful point about George H.W. Bush and the sweep of history, a man who literally connects us from Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
You know, when I think of George Bush, I think of the movie "It's a Wonderful Life," because it was a wonderful life. But he met every challenge with adamantly and strength and determination. I think maybe what's underreported right now was that Bush was best when things were worst. And I remember when the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981. And Washington was just, as you can imagine, was just crazy. And Al Haig was really not doing very well at the Reagan White House. Bush was in the air over Texas when he got word of the assassination attempt. And when he landed at Andrews Air Force, his staff said, "Look, you have to land on the White House lawn." He said, "Absolutely not. Only the president lands on the lawn. I will motorcade to my residence and then await my further, what I'm supposed to be doing." But he never pushed himself forward. He was cool under pressure. That's why Reagan later took away the chairman of the National Security Council away from Al Haig and gave it to Bush. Also in '85, when Reagan temporarily transferred presidential authority because he went he was in surgery, he was unconscious due to anesthesia. And Bush never made a big thing about it. He just he accepted it, but he kept a very low profile. And then, of course, also at the Reagan funeral, which I was at the National Cathedral. And as you can imagine, it was a pretty tough time for a lot of us who've been, part of the Reagan Revolution and been there, as foot soldiers in the Reagan Revolution for so many years. And Bush, not known for being a great orator, but he gave just a marvelous, masterful speech there for a eulogy there for Reagan. So when I think of George Bush, I think of John Kennedy's phrase "grace under pressure," and I think that's the epitome of President Bush.
Craig, I'd like to delve into a little bit more of the personal relationship between Reagan and Bush, because we've heard throughout the course of the coverage on almost all channels this morning that George H.W. Bush was arguably the most indispensable vice president to a president in history.